So today I wanted to see which Elden Ring class is the best. But here's the thing, I'm not going to be ranking them based on how good they are as starting classes. No. We're ranking them based on how good they are on a full playthrough. So this means I have to use all the starting gear equipment from each class. This also means that I can't equip any other armor, spell, or weapon apart from the ones that I started with. Now I did allow myself to equip talismans and ashes of war, but that's about it. But before I get to the ranking, if you like Soulsborne content like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and if you don't want to do that, then it's fine by me. Anyways, let's get to the ranking. Starting with the Bandit class, the reason why I rank it at last place is due to how terrible the weapon choice is. In terms of pure DPS, this has to be the worst class on the list, because the weapon you get is a f***ing kitchen knife. Now the only good thing about this is that it's fast, which means it can proc bleed pretty quickly, and it goes well with any multi-hit talismans. But even then it still sucks because the damage output is literally doo-doo water. Like come on, I know drunk dads that can hit harder than this. But again, the weapon genuinely sucks. Now apart from the weapon itself, you do get a parrying shield, which is nice for those who can actually parry, but since my reaction time is slower than a damn sloth, it was basically worthless. I did get a couple parries in on Margit though, which I'm pretty proud of. However, there are a couple Ash of Wars that does well with this, and one of them is the Blood Blade. It's the only saving grace of this build, since it barely uses any FP. Again, if you choose a cult and level arcane, you will be proccing bleed a lot. So am I saying that this is the worst class to begin with? No, but is it the worst class to beat the game with? Yes, at least in my opinion. Next up we have the Prisoner class. The Prisoner is a decent starting option, but in my opinion, if you want to do a full complete playthrough with this, let's just say it's not the best. First, let's talk about the armor. It's barely anything. Sure, it looks cool, but you will soon realize that it has terrible damage negation. Without the right defense talismans, you will get 3-shotted by a lot of the bosses, especially the ones in the late game. Another thing I really hate about this class is the main weapon, which is the S. Now me personally, I'm not really a big fan of thrusting swords in Elden Ring. First of all, their damage is not good, and sure, while they are fast and go well together with multi-hit talismans and the bleed affinity, again the damage is just not there. And the S-Stock can't even stagger smaller bosses like Malenia, which is crazy because even the weakest short sword is able to stagger her in one hit. But with the S-Stock, she just powers right through every attack. Now let's talk about the spell that you get. It's not really that good in my opinion, as it doesn't do a lot of damage. Overall, apart from Drip, the Prisoner is in my opinion one of the worst classes to beat the game with, and I only put it over the Bandit because at least the S-Dot does reasonable damage compared to the Great Knife. Now let's move on to the Prophet. Similar to the Prisoner, the robe provided barely any protection, which means again you're about to get 3-shotted by a lot of bosses. Now when I saw that the Prophet has not only a spear but heal and catch flame, I was excited. I thought that I would have a good time. Well, no, I didn't. First, let's talk about the spear. It's the only somewhat redeeming thing about this build, and even then it still suck ass. First of all, the range is terrible compared to most other spears, and the damage is disappointing. I realized this the most when I was fighting Malenia. Usually weapons like spears do good against her, even though I prefer slashing weapons as they cover a wide, amount of area, which is great because she likes to move around a lot. However, spears are good against her. But for this fight, man, it gave me a lot of issues. And it was mostly because of the range. Now the healing incantation, while not the best, still gets the job done. But the other somewhat redeeming thing about this build is catch flame. On its own, it doesn't do crazy amount of damage, but getting the Firecrack tier, the talisman that raises potency of incantations, and the Fire Scorpion charm makes it do decent damage. The only downside of it is the piss poor range. You literally have to be 2 inches away from any enemy in order to do, damage. But again, it's not a bad incantation. It's actually pretty decent, especially on regular runs where you can buff it using Golden Vow or Flame Grant Me Strength. So overall, the Prophet build is not super great when it comes on to finishing the game. You can do it, but you're gonna be in for a rough time. Next up we have the Wretch class. At first I thought this was going to be the worst class out of all the 10, but I was honestly surprised by how decent it was, at least in terms of damage output. Because if we're being honest, this class has the worst defense. I was even shocked that I got one-shotted by Godfrey's Eruption, even though I had a decent amount of health. You would think that I'm on New Game Plus, but no, I'm still on regular New Game. However, that aside, the Wretch is still pretty decent even though it only has one weapon, and that's the club. And man, I did not know how good this thing was. I swear I was bashing enemies and bosses left and right. Now equipping this with talismans such as the rotten sword or a regular sword insignia, any green turtle talisman, and two-handed sword talisman goes so hard. Now when it comes on to Ash of War, I only use Golden Vow for that damage output and negation increase. The Cragblade is pretty good for it as well, as it does a lot of stance damage. However, I needed that damage negation, so that's why I went with Golden Vow. And speaking of damage negation, you're gonna need a lot. I used the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, the Pearl Drake Talisman, which is great for negating non-physical damages. You can also get some boiled crabs or prawns for that extra, damage reduction. Overall, the wrench might not be the best starting class to beat the game with, as while you can do a decent amount of damage with it, the damage you receive is what sets it back a little, especially with the amount of high damaging enemies and bosses in the DLC. Next up we have the Confessor. The Confessor isn't a bad build to beat the game with. It has a decent weapon and urgent heal comes in clutch a lot of the times. With a weapon like the Broad Shield, it benefits best with multi-hit talismans. Bloodblade is also a decent Ash of War for this. However, if you want to go fully into Faith and Strength, then you can just add Golden Vow or Cragblade to it. There's not much that needs to be said. It's an okay class that has a decent weapon. The incantations is a bit lackluster, but again, urgent heal does come in clutch sometimes. Now we have the Hero, another somewhat surprising class. The Hero in the early game is very good, but it starts to fall off towards the late game, as the damage output, while decent, isn't super crazy. However, despite this, you will have an easier time trying to beat the game with this compared to the previous classes I've mentioned. First, let's start with the Battle Axe. The Axe class doesn't get as much love as the other weapons in Elden Ring, mostly due to its range. At least that's what I think. The range of the axe makes fighting nimble bosses a headache most of the times, and it's not like it does a crazy amount of damage. Not saying it doesn't do any decent damage, because it is a decent weapon. However, again, the damage does not make up for its range. But you can still try to maximize it as much as possible by either applying Golden Vow or Cragblade. But those are my personal preferences, as I like to get up close and personal with a lot of enemies and bosses. Now when it comes on to armor, it's not as bad as the Wretch, but it barely provides any damage negation. So again, if you're planning on doing a full playthrough with this build, you better stock up on some crabs and defense talismans. At 4th place we have the Vagabond. Now here's a class that has decent damage negation. I mean, I would hope so because the armor is somewhat heavy. Also, fun fact, Vagabond is the only starting class that makes you fat roll in the beginning. Now to be fair, the reason why you're fat rolling is because of the fact that you're carrying 2 melee weapons and one of them is somewhat heavy, but the armor also plays a part. The weapons that you get aren't too bad, even though I'm not the biggest fan. The longsword is a great weapon when it comes on to dealing multiple hits up close and personal. Now the damage of it isn't super great, but all you have to do is equip the multi-hit talisman and apply Golden Vow Ash of War, and you're pretty much good. I realized that this specific longsword wasn't performing well against certain bosses, but all I had to do was switch it out for the halberd. And sure, the regular halberd doesn't do any sexy amount of damage, but it is great for keeping your distance. Also, for the halberd, I found it best to apply blood tax onto it with the bleed affinity. All in all, Vagabond is a more than decent enough class for a full playthrough. Next up we have the Astrologer. Remember when I said that the Wretch was the most surprisingly decent build? Well, the Astrologer is another one. I hesitated on this build because in the back of my mind I thought it was going to be terrible, but man, I was shocked on how good it was, especially towards the late game and DLC. Usually most of these builds fall off towards the late game, but this was the opposite. In the early to mid game, you have to use your smithing stones on either the short sword or the staff. Now I'm a melee type of guy, so I put most of my upgrades toward the short sword, got the carrying grandeur, and set my affinity to magic so that way I can focus a lot of my stats into intelligence and mind. And sure, this build was kinda rough in the beginning, but towards the late game when I found all of the best talismans and upgrades, it was worth it. First of all, I was shocked by how much damage the glintstone pebblet was doing. Sure, it's nothing crazy, but the fact that you can spam these is amazing. Now some bosses like Melania for example can dodge these pretty easily, so you have to be a bit more strategic when using it. You also have Carrying Arc, which is just a slightly worse version of Glintstone Pebble, and that's because you can't spam it. Now the Ash of War I used was Carrying Grandeur, and I was surprised by the amount of damage this thing was doing. To be honest, this made me want to start a whole new playthrough using magic for real, as not gonna lie, it seems really fun. So yeah, that aside, despite the build taking a bit long to get good, the Astrologer is still one of the better classes to beat the game with. At 2nd place we have the Warrior class. Before I get started on the effectiveness, let's just take a moment to appreciate the sexy ass drip. Like come on now, this outfit looks cool as hell. Now that aside, if you watch some of my previous videos, you know that power standing curved swords are my favorite weapons, especially the bandit curved swords. I mean, their moveset are great and they do a nice amount of damage, especially the jump attacks. Let's not lie to ourselves now, the jump attacks are what makes almost any curved sword build broken. I mean, even if you don't have the claw mark talisman, they still do good damage. The only downside about the warrior's curved swords and the warrior class in general is that in the early to mid game, you're only going to be using one of the swords until you reach the mountaintops and farm Missoula. During my playthrough, I just paired them with the regular sword insignia for early game and rotten sword for late game. I also equipped the thorny crack tier for more damage on consecutive attacks, and I equipped the claw mark talisman as well. It's just a great build to complete the game with. Simple as that. Now the number one best starting class to beat the game with is the samurai class. Let's be honest, most of us expected the samurai to be number one. It's probably the only class that a lot of people actually beat the game with without changing the main weapon. It's literally that good. I mean, the armor provides decent damage negation, you also get a cool bow, it also has good early game stat distribution, but again, the best thing about the samurai class is the uchi katana. The katana is just a great weapon. Sure, it gets outclassed by the nagakiba and some other ones, but it's still really good. It does a decent amount of damage in both the early and end game, it does bleed damage, and if you apply seppuku and bleed affinity onto it, you will be proccing bleed a lot. It's the weapon that I know a lot of people beat the game with on their first playthrough because it's just solid. You can also make the build more powerful by equipping the Lord of Blood Exaltation and many multi-hit talismans. In the late game, you can also use the Thorn and Crack tier for more damage on consecutive hits. Again, there's just not much that needs to be said here. Samurai class is just fantastic for finishing the game because it has a great weapon, good early game stat distribution, provides decent damage negation, and oh yeah, did I mention the weapon? It's literally what makes this class the best. So those were my rankings of the starting classes in Elden Ring. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more like this, then hit like and subscribe. And if you don't want to do that, then that's fine by me. Anyways, shout out to my Patreon members on the screen, especially the paid members Johnny Jones, who was my first ever paid member, and Daniel Scotland, who just joined. Appreciate y'all for showing support. And if you want to know more about the Patreon, then the link is in the description. Also, check out my Discord if you want a place to talk about Soulsborne content or any other type of stuff. Anyways, I hope you guys have a good one, and yeah, that's it.